Hello everyone, this is Chapter 6 of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. In Chapter 5, the Lucases, basically the Bennets' next door neighbors, go to gossip about the ball and Mr. Bingley. They talk about how Mr. Bingley seems to like Jane very much and vice versa. Jane doesn't really share too much. She's not very forthcoming with that sort of information. And we also hear everyone's comments about Mr. Darcy, and they find him to be very obnoxious. Chapter 6. The ladies of Longbourn soon waited on those of Netherfield. So Longbourn is where the Bennets live, and Netherfield is where Mr. Bingley lives. So that's what's happening. The Bennets are going to see Mr. Bingley and company. The visit was returned in due form. Miss Bennet's pleasing manners grew on the goodwill of Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. And though the mother was found to be intolerable, and the younger sisters were not worth speaking to, a wish of being better acquainted with them was expressed towards the two eldest. So if you remember, if you're talking about Miss and the last name, we're talking about Jane Bennet. So Mr. Bingley's sisters find Jane Bennet and Elizabeth Bennet very good company. The mother, Mrs. Bennet, is intolerable. So, they'll just think Elizabeth was tolerable to Mr. Darcy, but not tempting enough to dance. So their opinion of Mrs. Bennet is really low, and they're not fans of the younger Bennet sisters, Mary, Kitty, or Lydia. By Jane this attention was received with the greatest pleasure, but Elizabeth still saw superciliousness in their treatment of everybody, hardly excepting even her sister, and could not like them, though their kindness to Jane, such as it was, had a value, as arising in all probability from the influence of their brother's admiration. So Elizabeth is a little bit more observant and a little bit less likely to think the best of people. So Elizabeth sees that Mr. Bingley's sisters are very proud, very conceited, and she notices that they're even a little bit condescending towards Jane Bennet, but they're still fairly nice, and it's probably because Mr. Bingley likes her. So Elizabeth is just willing to put up with their nonsense because if Jane and Mr. Bingley really like each other, then that would be a very good thing for everyone. It was generally evident, whenever they met, that he did admire her, so it's obvious Mr. Bingley likes Jane. And to her, it was equally evident that Jane was yielding to the preference which she had begun to entertain for him from the first, and was in a way to be very much in love. But she considered with pleasure that it was not likely to be discovered by the world in general, since Jane united with great strength of feeling, a composure of temper, and an uniform cheerfulness of manner, which would guard her from the suspicions of the impertinent. She mentioned this to her friend, Miss Lucas. So, Elizabeth can tell that Jane likes Mr. Bingley, but even though Jane may feel things very strongly, she doesn't always show that to the world. So, Elizabeth may be able to tell that Jane likes Mr. Bingley, but those impertinent, obnoxious people won't all be gossiping and saying, oh my gosh, she really likes him. It's going to seem more subtle to someone who doesn't know Jane well. So now Elizabeth is talking about this with Miss Lucas, Charlotte Lucas, her very good friend. It may perhaps be pleasant, replied Charlotte, to be able to impose on the public in such a case, but it is sometimes at a disadvantage to be so very guarded. If a woman conceals her affection with the same skill from the object of it, she may lose the opportunity of fixing him, and it will then be but poor consolation to believe the world equally in the dark. So Charlotte says, well, wait a second, if Jane's covering up that she likes him to the whole world, then what happens if Mr. Bingley doesn't realize that she likes him? That may cause some problems. There is so much of gratitude or vanity in almost every attachment that it is not safe to leave any to itself. We can all begin freely. A slight preference is natural enough, but there are very few of us who have heart enough to be really in love without encouragement. In 9 cases out of 10, a woman had better show more affection than she feels. Bingley likes your sister undoubtedly, but he may never do more than like her if she does not help him on. So Charlotte Lucas says, listen, it's better to show a little bit more affection than what you're really feeling, because no one likes to be in love and not encouraged about it. So Jane had better be very friendly, very accommodating, make it really clear that she likes Mr. Bingley, otherwise he may never act on his feelings. But she does help him on as much as her nature will allow. If I can perceive her regard for him, he must be a simpleton indeed, not to discover it too. Again, we don't get a dialogue tag, but we know that it's just Charlotte Lucas and Elizabeth Bennet who are speaking back and forth. So that's Elizabeth saying, I can tell that she likes him. He's got to be real stupid if he can't figure it out himself. Remember, Eliza, that he does not know Jane's disposition as you do. But if a woman is partial to a man and does not endeavor to conceal it, he must find it out. Perhaps he must if he sees enough of her. But though Bingley and Jane meet tolerably often, it is never for many hours together. And as they always see each other in large mixed parties, it is impossible that every moment should be employed in conversing together. Jane should therefore make the most of every half hour in which she can command his attention. When she is secure of him, there will be leisure for falling in love as much as she chooses. So, Charlotte says this kind of calculating thing. You know, they're seeing each other a lot, but they're not alone together very often. So Jane had better show that she likes him every chance that she gets. And then when she's secure of him, when she knows that he's definitely interested and he's made a little bit of a commitment, then she can kind of take her time falling in love. So Charlotte has a little bit of a backwards perspective from how I think we, in modern day society, think about romance and dating. Your plan is a good one, replied Elizabeth, where nothing is in question but the desire of being well married. And if I were determined to get a rich husband, or any husband, I dare say I should adopt it. But these are not Jane's feelings. She is not acting by design. As yet, she cannot even be certain of the degree of her own regard, nor of its reasonableness. She has known him only a fortnight. A fortnight is 2 weeks, so Jane and Bingley have only been talking to each other for a 2-week period. She danced 4 dances with him at Meryton. She saw him one morning at his own house, and has since dined in company with him 4 times. This is not quite enough to make her understand his character. So Elizabeth says, listen, if you just want to snag a husband, or snag a rich husband, or any husband, that's a fine plan. But Jane hasn't really figured out if she likes him or not just yet. She wants to kind of take her time with this whole thing. Not as you represent it. So now this is Charlotte responding to that. Not as you represented. Had she merely dined with him, she might only have discovered whether he had a good appetite. But you must remember that 4 evenings had been also spent together, and 4 evenings may do a great deal. Yes, these 4 evenings have enabled them to ascertain that they both like Vindt-Un better than commerce. Those are both card games. So Elizabeth saying, oh, they really haven't known that much. They know what card games they like, but that's not saying too much about someone's character. But with respect to any other leading characteristic, I do not imagine that much has been unfolded. Well, said Charlotte, I wish Jane success with all my heart, and if she were married to him tomorrow, I should think she has as good a chance of happiness as if she were to be studying his character for a 12-month, or a year. Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance. If the dispositions of the parties are ever so well known to each other, or ever so similar beforehand, it does not advance their felicity in the least. They always continue to grow sufficiently unlike afterwards to have their share of vexation, and it is better to know as little as possible of the defects of the person with whom you are to pass your life. So Charlotte's saying, when people are married, they tend to grow apart, things tend to go wrong, it's just, you know what, it's all just a matter of chance, you might as well just, jump right into marriage. You make me laugh, Charlotte, but it is not sound. You know it is not sound, and that you would never act in this way yourself. So Elizabeth says, you're full of baloney. I don't think even you would follow just that plan. Occupied in observing Mr. Bingley's attention to her sister, Elizabeth was far from suspecting that she was herself becoming an object of some interest in the eyes of his friend. Mr. Darcy had at first scarcely allowed her to be pretty. Remember, he calls her, she's tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. Mr. Darcy had at first scarcely allowed her to be pretty. He had looked at her without admiration at the ball, and when they next met, he looked at her only to criticize. But no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she had hardly a good feature in her face, than he began to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. To this discovery succeeded some others equally mortifying. Though he had detected with a critical eye more than one failure of perfect symmetry in her form, he was forced to acknowledge her figure to be light and pleasing. And in spite of his asserting that her manners were not those of the fashionable world, he was caught by their easy playfulness. Of this she was perfectly unaware. To her, he was only the man who made himself agreeable nowhere, and who had not thought her handsome enough to dance with. So at first, Mr. Darcy doesn't like Elizabeth, and then he starts to look at her more, and he's like, her face is kind of animated, she's very playful, and then he thinks, oh, she's kind of pretty, and even though her manners maybe aren't the most fashionable or the best, she has that sort of like fun, playful attitude about her. So he's starting to like her, but she has no idea, especially when you consider that he's very reserved, doesn't really talk too much to people he's not familiar with, and the fact that he completely snubbed her at the last ball. He began to wish to know more of her, and, as a step towards conversing with her himself, attended to her conversation with others. His doing so drew her notice. It was at Sir William Lucas's, where a large party was assembled. So, that little paragraph does kind of confirm this idea that Mr. Darcy doesn't talk to people he doesn't know too well. As a step to beginning to talk with Elizabeth, he listens pretty attentively to her conversation. So he hasn't said anything really to her just yet, but he's just watching and listening to how she speaks. "What does Mr. Darcy mean," said she to Charlotte, "by listening to my conversation with Colonel Forster?" "That is a question which Mr. Darcy only can answer. But if he does it any more, I shall certainly let him know that I see what he is about. He has a very satirical eye, and if I do not begin by being impertinent myself, I shall soon grow afraid of him." So Elizabeth just notices that he seems to be watching her, not that he is interested. On his approaching them soon afterwards, though without seeming to have any intention of speaking, Miss Lucas defied her friendship to mention a subject to him, which immediately provoking Elizabeth to do it, she turned to him and said, "Do you not think, Mr. Darcy, that I expressed myself uncommonly well just now, when I was teasing Colonel Forster to give us a ball at Meryton?" "With great energy, but it is a subject which always makes a lady energetic." "You are severe on us." "It will be her turn soon to be teased," says Miss Lucas. "I am going to open the instrument, Eliza, and you know what follows." So Charlotte Lucas is kind of egging Elizabeth on. She's saying, "Go play Fiato. I'm going to open it up. You should play soon." "You are a very strange creature by way of a friend."